So I'm Michael Swingler. I'm the Associate Creative Director at Cainkade, and we are a product design and development studio based, as he said, in the Bay Area and also in New York. So some of the biggest considerations that we like to take into account when we're working on televisions for applications for the television are we like to consider the remote, the actual distance a user is from the television, and the platform that these applications actually run on. So recently, we ported an iPad app for Gaiam TV to the Amazon Fire platform. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Gaiam TV, they're like the Netflix of health and wellness. And throughout the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be walking you through some of these design considerations that we took into account when we were working on this project. So we like to think as the remote as being kind of the bread and butter for interfacing with television apps. And this remote actually dictated the majority of the design decisions that we made when we were working on this project. For instance, the iPad app that we designed gave users direct access to the navigation in this nonlinear fashion, whereas the remote forces the users into this linear mode, which creates some issues that we had to overcome. And one of the ways that we overcame this is by the use of what we like to call default selected states. And these default selected states, we like to think they're very similar to those "You Are Here" posters that you see in the mall. And it basically helps the user give a visual representation of where to begin to navigate. So speaking of navigation, we like to think that television interface navigation is similar to that old video game Frogger, where all the action happens along the X and Y axis. So because of this, we approached the design with this grid in mind, and this grid actually helps facilitate the navigation. Now, because of the remote, location of core functionality is key. So we had to strategically locate certain things like this See All Videos button in the far left. And this reduces the amount of button clicks that a user has to take with the remote, making it easier to get to things. So we also like to keep things simple, especially when there's something complex on the screen like search. So we strip a lot of the user interface off of the screen so users can focus on what they're actually doing instead of being distracted by what's on the screen. So as I said before, distance is another thing we have to keep in mind. The biggest factor that I've kind of found with distance is distance affects the legibility of things. So one of the ways we deal with this is by size. It's very obvious, but you generally have to make things much larger on television interfaces. The buttons, the logos, the text input boxes, they generally have to be larger than you would normally see on laptops and tablets. Another thing that we like to consider is the use of typography. Selecting the right typeface is key. That typeface needs to be visible from when you're sitting way back on your couch. But even once you've selected that typeface, you have to make sure you select the right weights within that font family. Those thin fonts look nice on print, but they tend to break apart and become illegible on the screen. So we like to think that contrast creates clarity. So on this screen, you can tell that you are in the yoga section, the style filter is selected. And these color choices and this contrast, it helps create a visual hierarchy throughout the rest of the application. So every platform is different. They come in all shapes and sizes, different remotes, different processing powers, even different interface conventions. And although we didn't have to take any interface conventions necessarily into account for this project, we definitely had to keep it in mind because we know that this project, this application is going to live as a part of an overall larger ecosystem, and we need to keep consistency throughout this application and moving forward when it's ported to other platforms. So, unlike other devices, television platforms lack a keyboard, and therefore making complex tasks like entering data becomes hard. So we don't think that these types of actions are best suited for television applications. They're better suited for other devices. So color becomes an issue because the color profiles differ from your television and your laptop or your computer. So you really we had to pay a lot of attention to our colors and our gradients to reduce that ugly color banding that you sometimes see with these television apps. So again, some of the biggest considerations that we usually take into account when we're working on these television apps are, how the remote affects the design. It affects navigation. how that distance from the television, how that affects legibility, and how the platform affects the interface conventions that you take into account. And thank you.